today we will be talking about the minority attack. And I will just make sure that everything is working as it is supposed to. That was loud. I'm very sorry. Okay. So I will be reading both the co-chess Twitch chat and the YouTube chess 24 chat. So if you have anything you're wondering about, if you have any questions, if there's something you're curious about, if you think there's something which isn't explained well enough or something you would like to have explained again, maybe in a different way, maybe just for me to take it slower, then please let me know and I will do everything I can to make sure that everyone's prayers are heard. So as said before, today we will be talking about the minority attack. And the minority attack is explained very easily when a minority of pawns is attacking a majority of pawns, as we can see here on the board. It's a very common occurrence in an opening like the Queen's Gambit, for example. And this structure we have here is called the Carlsbad structure. We see that the structure is almost symmetrical, but there is some key differences, or there is one key difference. This pawn is on c6. If the pawn was on e6 instead of c6, then we would have a completely symmetrical structure. But here it is on c6, and that's why it's called the Carlsbad structure. So in the minority attack, we see here that these two pawns, they are a minority compared to these three pawns, the majority. And what we try to do when we make a minority attack is that we try to create a weakness for our opponent, which will be easy to attack. As you can see, as I've already made some arrows here, what the plan is, we want to push the pawns. There's a few different ways that black can meet the minority attack, and we will take a look at several of them. Very typical would be the move b4. This is just, of course, the typical position that I'm showing here and how the minority attack works. So let's say that white plays b4. The plan is to play a4 and b5 to try to create a weakness here on c6. Here black can reply in two ways. The first way black can reply is by playing b5. b5 is a very double-edged move, and you have to think a lot before you make this kind of move, because usually there would of course be several pieces on the board. And with the move b5, what you do is weaken the c6 pawn a lot. So b5 is often played when you have a knight which can jump to the c4 square. For example, a knight on d7, which can quickly jump to b6 and c4 before the opponent gets the chance to attack the c6 pawn. Something you also have to keep in mind when playing b5 is that sometimes the opponent will have a rook on a1 and therefore push a4, trying to create weaknesses here. Let's say black made a stupid, or just a random move, and white got to take here. Then, first of all, white would have an attack against this backwards pawn on a7, typically with a rook on a1, and the d5 pawn would be weak. So a move like a4, let's just go back. A move like a4 here should often be replied with a6 if the pawn is not already on a6, so that after a takes b5, then black can also contest on the a file. And again with the same plan of getting a knight to this c4 square, for example via d7, or also very often via d6, a key square in the Queen's Gambit and in the Carlsbad structure. But of course b5, as I said, is a very double-edged move, and you have to think before you play this. And often it's not possible to play b5. The most common move in these types of positions is a6 to prevent white from playing this b5 move, because the pawn would be hanging. So white continues with the plan of a4 to push b5. push b5 and create a weakness here on c6. We will see how. Let's say black waited and white now plays b5. There's many ways that black can meet this move. The most common and the way that is usually the best, if it is possible, is by taking with the a pawn and then after a takes, pushing c5. c5 is a very important move in this structure when white creates the minority attack, but it's been proven often, many times, that after c5, if black gets c5 in under favorable circumstances, then black will be completely fine. Even, let's say, white takes, and then black will recapture this pawn. So this pawn is not here, which means that black is left with an isolated pawn on d5, but it's been proven time and time again that the pawn is not too weak and that black is completely fine. We will see a game later where this indeed happened. Another way to meet b5 is the opposite of a takes, and c5. It is c takes, and a5, creating a pass pawn here on the a file. The third way to meet b5 is by taking the pawn twice. Oftentimes, white will be able to recapture the pawn, let's say with a bishop on e2 or d3, or with a knight on c3, or a rook on b1, which will mean that this pawn on b7 after the b5 pawn is captured will be weak. But the question is also the d5 pawn, but the question is also, can white attack them? This is one of the least favorable ways of meeting the minority attack. The least favorable way by far to meet the minority attack is, let's say that black is not ready to meet b5 with any of the moves that we've looked at. Black is not ready to take with the a pawn and go c5. Black is not ready to take with the c pawn and go a5, because of course it depends a lot on how the remaining pieces on the board they are placed. Yes, I'm trying to read all the comments here, but unfortunately I only have two screens. So I have to switch a bit around on the screens. I will of course be trying to include the audience as much as possible. So if you have any questions, do let me know, and I will try to read all of them. The least favorable way, as I said before, by meeting the minority attack is by taking, well, either just playing a move like I have to do by taking with the a pawn, for example, and then after a takes, then if black is not ready, if black is not ready to play c5, and in, for example, here playing king g8, and white gets to take this pawn on c6 without being then now this pawn on c6 is very weak. If black is not able to push c5, then white will very often be able to put a piece here on c5, or just put immense pressure on this c6 pawn. And the other point is that when this c6 pawn falls, then the d5 pawn will have no protection, as the c6 pawn is the only pawn protecting the d pawn, and then the d pawn will also be weak. So this is something you have to be very careful of, because you do not want to lose all of the pawns. It's very important to be able to meet the minority attack in a favorable way. Another way is, let's say black made a waiting move here, and after a takes, then both the a6 pawn and the c6 pawn will be weak. But let's jump right into a position where this minority attack will happen. This is the game between between Igor Kenkin and Kenin-Asrian. They are both around 2600, which means that they are very strong players, of course. And Igor Kenkin, the white player, he is a complete expert in these minority attacks in the Queen's Gambit. We have jumped right to this position, arising from the Queen's Gambit, and here the white player Igor Kenkin, he played Rook b1. What he's trying to do here is prepare the move b4, a4 and b5, creating this weakness on c6. Here black played knight e6, trying to yes, do not lose all your pawns, trying to improve the knight on f8 by putting it on a better square. We can also see that this knight protects the c5 square, which means that when white plays b4, b5, then there's a good chance that black will be more likely to meet it with c5. Also, he's attacking the bishop, which has to do something. White played bishop h4, and now black played knight g7. This is also a very common idea. What black wants to do with this knight g7 move is push this bishop on f5, exchanging the light squared bishops, as all of black's pawns are on light squares. White continued with the minority attack by playing b4 with the b5 plan, and black met it with a6, the very typical move that I was explaining in the beginning. White continued the plan with a4, now very soon being able to play this move b5. Black continued with his plan, bishop f5, trying to exchange the light squared bishop to take away some of the pressure b5 will later create. White exchanged the bishop, and now once again the knight is attacking the bishop on h4, and white made the choice to take the knight on f6 with the bishop. This is also a common idea, as when this bishop recaptures, there's no pressure against the b4 pawn or any of the more weakened dark squares in white's camp. And after this, white finally got through with the minority attack. White played b5. And since this bishop on f6 is no longer protecting the c5 square also, then black is not able to play c5 himself. So let's try to think. I will let the viewers think for a few minutes here about how you would like to meet this minority attack. What do you think is the best way here? And then I will be reading the comments while you hopefully say some very clever stuff. Resign? No. Don't resign. And let me just move the arrows so that they don't confuse. Oopsie doopsie. Confuse anyone. That was a mistake, by the way. Don't think that that was the move, please. Famous wizard, you have to insert a clever comment. Okay, Lily Wannabe. You don't want to play bishop e7 in this position, because you have to meet this minority attack somehow. If you don't do anything, then white will be able to create quite a few weaknesses in your camp. Also, by putting the bishop on e7, you close down this semi-open e-file for the rook. And the bishop is fine on f6, it's not bad. So do we have any other ideas? Someone says take it all. Oops, sorry about that. So one way to meet the minority attack is by taking 3 times. 2 times. So this is an idea. what you have to keep in mind here is that in this position, white will be taking with the rook. And now there will be a double attack on the d5 pawn and the b7 pawn. And you cannot take both the pawn, you cannot protect both the pawns at the same time. The only way to protect the d5 pawn is either by playing rook a5 or knight e7. Yes, I am reading chat, but I'm only replying to chess questions. Otherwise, play knight e7, but in that case, both the b7 pawn would be hanging here. The b7 pawn is hanging, and here the b7 pawn is also hanging, and the d5 pawn will keep on being weak. Another suggestion is by taking with the c pawn and going a5. This would be a good suggestion if it wasn't because this d5 pawn was so weak. In this position, white has queen a2, which is a very, very strong move. Now the only way for black to protect the pawn on d5 is by playing knight e7, but after knight e7, white can play this amazing b6 move. And we see here how the knight on c3 can jump to a4, and this amazing square c5. This rook can go to b5 if it wants, attacking some more pawns. Let me just remove some of the arrows. And this knight can also go to b5 if it wants, possibly jump into c7. So this would be a bad way of meeting the minority attack. Do we have more suggestions? Are we allowed to make jokes about countering the minority attack with the Anna majority defense? Yes. Why not c5? In this position, c5 would be hanging a pawn. So I think that's a bit too much for black. You don't want to give a pawn away here. The way black met the minority attack was to take with the a pawn, and after a takes, he played knight d6. And this knight is very well placed on d6. It's better placed on d6 than f5, and it can possibly go to c4 at some point, or e4. Now white takes on c6, and black took back. Already, if we go back to this position, white is actually quite a bit better. It's not winning, but black has some serious practical problems, because here the weakness on c6 is very difficult for black to deal with, and there's no favorable way to push c5 here. And if c6 falls, then d5 will also be very weak. White played a very, very nice move here, because as I said before, this knight on d6 really wants to go to c4. So therefore, white tried to prevent this by playing knight d2, taking away this c4 square. If the knight goes to c4 now, then white will just take it, and black will have two weak pawns on the c file, and they will probably both fall. Yes, c5 was in my explanations before, that's true. Let's just go back. With c5, but you need a piece to defend the pawn on c5, because if you play c5 without having a piece to defend it, then the pawn is just hanging. Let's say you had a knight on d7, then after c takes and knight takes d5, maybe it would be possible. Or let's say this rook on e8 was on c8, then it would also be better. But if you just play c5 without having a piece to defend it, then you're just losing the pawn. So here the weakness on c6 was a lot, and white played knight d2 to prevent the knight from going to c4. Black tried to activate his rook with rook a3, and white played knight e2, another very good move. This knight has several ways it can go. First of all, the knight moving means that the queen is now attacking c6, and black has to do something about this. Secondly, this knight on e2 can go to f4, and from f4 it can go to d3 and c5, or d3 and b4 and attacking c6 if it wants. So here white is playing very well. Of course, he's an almost 2600 GM, so we do not expect less. But he's also playing at another 2600 GM. Here black played queen a8 to protect the pawn, and white put more pressure on the pawn with rook f to c1. Black tried to activate the rook on a3 by putting it on a2. And white traded the rooks, and black put the knight on f5. But very soon white won the pawn on c6, as we will see in a second. Oh, sorry, my face is itchy. It's really not on purpose, my face just always gets itchy. Okay, here white played knight f3, and then white has more ideas. Firstly, these knights on f3 and f4, they are very, very well placed. They have several ideas, like going to d3 and c5 or b4. Also, at some point, white will be able to start pushing his kingside pawns. This knight on f3 is also better placed on f3 than it is on d2. It can help the advance of the g and h pawns. Black decided to bring his rook into the game, as the rook on e8 was not doing much. It was looking at this pawn, which was already protected. So he brought the rook to b8, and white replied with rook a1. Now this is forcing a trade of the queens, which is very nice for white. The queen has nowhere to go. Let's say it goes to b7, then we have a trade of queens. And if black played as in the game by taking the queen on b2 with the rook, then white took the rook on a8 with a check. And now with more pieces off the board, then this c6 pawn is even more weak because black has less pieces to defend it. Also, this rook on a8 is very active and can possibly go to c8 when the knight isn't protecting. If the knight moves, for example, to f5, then attacking this pawn even more. Black played king g7. There was really no other way to meet the check, and white played g4, gaining space on the queen side, on the king side, sorry. Maybe later in the game, bringing his king to g3, playing h4, making it even more difficult for black to make moves. Black replied with h6, and white played h4. After knight g8, we can see that the knight is not very well placed, and now white got the chance to play g5. We see that white is managing to create more and more problems for black, as this c6 pawn is still weak, and black's pieces, they have less and less squares to move to. Because after h takes g5, this knight is protecting the g5 pawn, so the bishop cannot take, and the bishop has to drop back to e7. It has no other squares. On d8, it will be captured by the rook. Why not maneuver the other knight? Which one of the knights? And now we also see that this knight on g8 has nowhere to go. Yes, so they kept on playing for a bit, and now white got his rook to c7, attacking the c6 pawn there. And if white will be able to manage to bring a knight, sorry, to e5 without hanging the g5 pawn, then he will be very happy. And also he can play the knight to e5 and still hang the g5 pawn, as the pawn on f7 is weak and the rook is on the 7th rank. This was actually what happened in the game, because after rook b6, white played knight e5, both attacking the c6 pawn and the f7 pawn if this bishop on e7 ever moves. Black made a waiting move. There was really no other way for the rook to move, and after king g2, white just improved his position, and now he took the pawn. The bishop took on g5, but after knight takes d5, rook a2 and knight e5, white's position is completely dominating a pawn up, and he managed to convert this position very easily. So, is there anyone who has any questions to this game? Something they would like me to explain again? Or should we continue with the next one? Which game was this? This game was the game between Igor Kenkin and Kenin-Asrian. I'm not sure which year it was. But Kenin-Asrian is an Armenian player and Igor Kenkin is Russian. What was the opening? The opening was the Queen's Gambit, but the opening wasn't really... the opening moves weren't that relevant, because we were just jumping directly to the minority attack, and then we saw how white managed to exploit the weakness on c6. Thank you. Yes, those are their names correctly spelled in the YouTube chat. Great, let's move on to the next game. I will this time be taking one of my own games that I have played before, and we will see how I try to deal with the minority attack. Follow main lines. We're not really looking at opening moves today. We're looking at the minority attack. Here in this game I was black, and I played c6. Now my question is, does white here want to play b4, trying to start a minority attack? So does white want to do it, and why does white want to do it, and why doesn't white want to do it? So we're seeing some no's in chat. And that is correct. Starting the minority attack in this position isn't very favorable for white. It is not the end of the world, but it could potentially create problems. Because when moving this pawn from b2 to b4, yes, you start the minority attack, but you also weaken some squares in your own camp. My opponent, he played b4. Not very well timed, but he knew the idea of the minority attack. Black has a few different options here. One could be to improve the position of the bishop on e6 by playing bishop f5. Another one could be playing b5, as we also spoke about before, one way to meet the minority attack. As we see, this knight on d7 can very quickly jump to b6 and c4, before white gets a chance to attack this pawn on c6. Of course, this is not the only way to meet the minority attack, and I decided to play queen b8. This is also a typical move. First of all, when the queen is on the c-file, sometimes it can get annoyed by a rook on c1, creating some x-ray. Secondly, the queen can go to a7, and also the queen steps out of the pin from the bishop. Queen c7 might have been better, but only very, very slightly. Queen b8 is not a bad move. Here, white felt obligated to trade this bishop on f6 with the knight on g5 with the knight on f6. What he was a bit worried about could potentially be this knight jumping to e4, as white will not be able to capture it, because after pawn captures, this knight has to move, and when the knight moves, the pawn on h2 is hanging. So he traded the bishop for the knight, and played knight a4. This is another way to play the minority attack. He wants to place the knight on a4 to c5, where the knight will be very, very well placed, and black will not be able to threaten the knight with b6. Sometimes he or she will, sometimes they won't, but playing b6 will weaken the pawn on a6. Does black have ideas of playing bishop g4 and bishop takes f3 to remove the defender of h2? Eccentric horse. We will get to that. You are a bit ahead. And here I played knight e4 to try to take some more control over this c5 square if the knight was to jump in there, and also trying to take some control over this c3 square, as if the knight moves, then the knight will be able to attack both the queen and the bishop. And those are also some of the problems when you move a pawn. You leave some squares behind, as the pawns can never go back. And in this case, the c3 square will be weakened. Thank you. The previous game was Kenin versus Asrian at the FIDE World Championship knockout in 2001. So I played knight e4, and white played rook c1. Oopsie, that was not on purpose. What he wanted to do was take some more control over the c3 square, so that he would be able to more easily put a knight on c5. Now I played, why not knight takes b6? Maybe you mean knight to b6. Knight to b6 is also a possibility, but I will just move my rook to a7. And this might seem a little bit strange, I agree, but this knight on b6 has no defenders. And afterwards I will be able to attack the knight with queen c7 or queen b6, and there's no way for white to defend it, so it would have to move again. And you can try to get this pawn to a5, protecting the knight, because after a4 the pawn on b4 is hanging. Also, black has ideas with playing a5 sometimes, and then the rook is not unuseful on a7, because when the a file opens, then the rook is very happy on a7, because I can play queen c7, and when the knight moves, this other rook can swing to a8. I hope that was explanation enough. Yes, so in this position after rook c1, I played a little bit of a dubious move. I played a5, trying to create weaknesses myself. Trying to create a weakness on b4. A better move could have been queen c7, or a very interesting move here is b5. Something which is different from the other positions, or from early at least, is that now there's no knight on d7 being able to jump to b6 and c4, which means that this pawn on c6 is quite weak. But in this specific position, it actually does not matter too much, because this white knight has to do something. It can go two places. It can go to b2 and it can go to c5. If the knight goes to b2, then black can play a5, trying to create weaknesses here. And if the knight, for example, moves to d3, then black will be and the knight would move to d3 to protect this pawn on b4. For example, if after a5 black took this pawn on c6, then white took the pawn on c6, then black would be able to take on b4 and take with the bishop, and now this pawn on b5 is not weak. And we see a lot of dark weak squares in white's position, and the pawn on b5 is a passed pawn, and black is actually close to winning in this position. Let me see. Yes. So instead, white would have to play knight d3 to protect the pawn on b4, and after a takes and a takes, rook a2, trying to activate this rook on the second file. And once again, after rook takes c6, here after rook c8, again black is almost close to winning, because white's pieces are so passive and black is getting a lot of activity down the a and c file. Also with the bishop pair here, this position is overwhelming even though black is behind a pawn. So instead of knight b2 after b5, white would also be able to play knight c5. And after knight c5, black would trade the knight. Now the rook cannot take, as that would lose an exchange. So instead, white would have to take with a pawn, either the d or c pawn, which would mean that this pawn on c6 is not too weak anymore. Can you flip the board? Yes, I can. That was not, this is the flip board, yes. I hope that helps and not confuses more. If we have some other opinions whether the board should be flipped or not, please let me know. But now this pawn on c6 isn't too weak anymore. The only piece being able to attack it is this knight. This bishop has to move somewhere. It could move to e5, as after knight takes and queen takes. Then this bishop would actually have quite the life on the light squares. And after queen d2, black is a little bit better. Also with the idea of the a5 break still in the position and opening the a file for the rook. So b5 was definitely an interesting option. I decided to play a5 to create weaknesses on b4 and a3 and opening the a file for my rook. Here, white only had one decent move, and that move was knight c5 to try to limit this bishop's scope on the f8 a3 diagonal. Knight c5 is a very strong move, but my opponent didn't find it. He tried to develop his queen instead with queen b3, which means that after I take, then he's trying to say that he is protecting the pawn on b4. I cannot take it because the bishop would be hanging, and now he still wants this knight to go to c5. But here, after queen b3, I played bishop g4. And the point is, first of all, the point is to try to get rid of this knight on f3, which is protecting some of the key squares. The h2 pawn it's protecting, and it's protecting this d2 square. The knight is also pinned because this bishop on e2 is hanging after the queen moves away from b3. And if black is allowed to take and bishop takes, then this knight d2 move would attack both the queen and the rook, a fork. My opponent replied to this move with knight b6, attacking the rook on a8. I took on f3, bishop takes, and knight d2. He played queen c3 as I was attacking the queen on b3, and here I managed to throw away my advantage. The calculations here are not easy to do, there are some complications, but black is actually winning if I had found the right moves. You can play knight takes f3, or you can play bishop takes h2 first, and after king h1 then knight takes f3. The hard part about these moves are not to find them, the hard part is to evaluate them, because here black is losing an exchange. If you allow f4, then the bishop on h2 will be trapped, so you have to do something about that first. Possibly queen d6 to try to get the queen to this h6 square, threatening mate. But I did not, well, I did see these moves, but I didn't evaluate them correctly. I instead, in this position, took the rook on f1, and after king takes, I took on b4, because I thought that this position was very good for me. I had seen the knight d7 attacking the queen and the rook, so here I won't be up in exchange. But what we will see, I started, before taking the knight here on f8, I started by giving a check to get the king away and place my queen on a better square. a6 is a better square here than a7, because here on a6 the queen has more scope, while on a7 it's just looking into some pawns. So I took the knight, but this position is actually quite equal. The problem for white here is the weaknesses on the entire queen side. After these pawns on a2 and b2, they have been moved. This pawn is on b4. There's a lot of weak squares in here that black will be able to attack. We can see that there is not many weak squares in black's position. And I managed to win this position anyway, because of the weak squares on the queen side. But instead of seeing that, I would like to continue to another game. This game right here. In this position, white played b5. How should black reply to this minority attack? And what do you think the evaluation of the position is? This is another one of my games. I am black in this position. And I replied to the minority attack in the wrong way, and I eventually lost the game. So remember, I'm reading chat, so you just have to write some clever comments and then we will talk about them. The best way to learn is interactive learning. Knight c4 has been suggested. yeah, I will give you a few things to Sim, nice to see you. Nice to see that you are in chat. I don't know how much you will be learning from this though. Of course, you can learn a lot from this, but Sim, who's in the YouTube chat, is a very strong player himself. Way stronger than me. So he, of course, knows all of these things. And why here? Thank you for the raid of a group of 6 people. Livy Wannabe, you may say that you learned the structure already, but there are so many differences in the positions compared to how the pieces are standing. So as we also saw before in the game between the 2600 players, even though you're a very, very strong player, these things can be very difficult to deal with, as white and as black. So do we have any more suggestions? We have a suggestion of knight to c4, and let me just put that on the board. This is one suggestion. Another suggestion from Sim is c takes, a takes, and a5. Thank you, Livy. Appreciate it. Oh, now I understand. Okay, I see. I see. I'm so sorry. Yes, you have gotten better at this structure. I appreciate it. Thank you for the nice comment. Can you gain space on the king side? That is another way. So that means just leaving the queen side. Knight takes a4. Okay, the problem with knight takes a4 in this position is that the pawn is defended. So after knight takes a4, knight takes a4 would be losing a piece. Otherwise, knight takes a4 would be a very good move. Oops. And the problem with knight c4, which was also suggested, is that this pawn on a6 will be hanging after a takes, and knight takes. And even though you think you might win this pawn on a4 after rook a7, then when the knight goes back to c5, it is still protecting the pawn on a5. Otherwise, it could be an interesting idea to go knight c4. Oops. Oh, no, that was not what I meant. I wanted to remove this arrow. Very good. Okay. The correct way to meet this minority attack, as Sim mentioned, was to not take with the a pawn, take with the c pawn, and play a5. In this position, white is a little bit better, but black will be able to create some counter play with this a pawn. And this knight on b6 is well placed. It's attacking. It's not attacking. It is protecting the d5 pawn. Another way black could do it would also be by taking this pawn on b5. One of the other ways to meet the minority attack. This is just a bit more of a difficult position. It's better than what I played in the game, but after a move like rook b1, knight c4, and taking, then once again these two pawns would be weak, and it is not easy for black to defend this position. Probably b6 here is the best move, as the knight is protecting the pawn on b6, but sometimes white also has some e4 ideas to try to remove the defender of the knight. So this was also a decent idea, but the best one was to play a5 to try to have the least weaknesses as possible. The pawn on b7 isn't very weak because the only way for white to attack it is with the knight on c5, and the pawn is already protected by the rook on e7. And this pawn might create counterplay and a few problems for black. The knight is on b6, is going to c4. What I played in the game wasn't very good. I played a takes, and after a takes, I put my knight on c4. But now after b takes c6 and b takes c6, I have this chronic weakness on c6. This pawn is very, very bad. I will never be able to push it to c5 as this knight on c5 is blocking the pawn. And white actually showed great technique in this position. My opponent was an IM, so you know, never easy to play against these players. They always find a way to put pressure. First, he improved his rook on c1 by putting it on one of the open files. I put my knight to d2. I wanted to trade this monster knight on c5 with my knight on c4. And I did it by going to c2 and then to e4. But my opponent found a very nice idea here. He took the knight, and after knight takes, he went rook a5. Not rook a6. Rook a6, I can play rook e6. And now I'm protecting the pawn twice, and the pawn is attacked twice, so my opponent cannot take it. And maybe I will be able to improve the position of my king here. But my opponent played rook a5, a very strong move. What he's doing now is that he is attacking the d5 pawn. And he's attacking the d5 pawn because if he takes and I take, my rook on c8 will be hanging and he will have won a pawn, and the d5 pawn will continue being weak. The only way for me to defend my pawn on d5 is by protecting my rook on c8. Now if he takes the pawn, I can take back with the pawn and my rook is no longer hanging on c8. But in this position, now he can move his rook to c5. And I can not protect c6 and d5. The only way for me to protect c6 is by playing rook e6, but then the same thing happens as before. Then he can take on d5 as my rook on c8 is no longer protected. And this rook endgame is winning for white. So I cannot protect c6 in any way. I decided to put my rook on d8, just hoping that he would play a stupid move like king d2, because king h2, because then I can place my rook on d6. And now if he takes the pawn, then I can take with the rook. Why not activate your king for attacking purposes? Yeah, I can put my king here, but the position is just completely lost. Here I have to play rook d8 anyway, because if I don't play rook d8 now, let's say I play g6, then rook d6, and now there's no way for me to protect my d5 pawn. So here I played rook d8, my opponent took the pawn, and he won this endgame very nicely. There was no doubt that he was going to win this. He's a pawn up in the rook endgame, and the d5 pawn is just very, very weak. My last example is another one. This game is one of my own games from London Chess Classic 2019, round 1. My last example is another one of my games. I play this structure quite a lot. Usually aren't rook endgames drawn, even when one side is a pawn up. It very, very much depends on the position. And in that position there was just simply nothing to do because the pawn on d5 was too weak. If the pawn had been on e6 instead of d5, the position would have been objectively a draw. But when the pawn is as weak as it is on d5, there's nothing to do. This is another one of my own games. As you can see, I'm playing this structure quite a lot. And in this game, I was white. And here we will see another way, which we talked about earlier, of meeting the minority attack. My opponent played knight e6 in this position, trying to... yes, type on, that is correct, thank you. Trying to take some control over the c5 square, because he's anticipating the minority attack. And if I get b5, b4, b5, he wants to meet it with c5, and then the knight on e6 is well placed. Also, the knight can go to g5. I played b4, starting the minority attack. And after a takes and a takes, my opponent found a very nice idea. There's a few different ways he can play here. What you have to be careful with if you play e4 is that the d4 pawn is weak, and in this position it's actually hanging. You always have to be careful when moving your pawns. So this position, which ideas do we have for black? And we don't have much time. We do not have much time, but I believe that we can do this. I believe in you, chat. Come on, say some clever stuff. I know you learned something today. I know you did. I see a nice idea. Okay, so eccentric horse, doubling rooks on the A file is a good idea. For example, playing rook A3, but I think you need to be able to meet B5 a little bit better. B6 was what my opponent played in the game, and this is a nice move. B5 is also a good move. B6 is the best move, but B5 is a very close candidate. And the reason for this position is a bit different than the other ones we've had, because now there's no knight on D7, so it can't go to B6 and C4. But white cannot really attack this C6 pawn very easily. I can't get my own knight to C5, but B5 is a fine move here, and sometime in the future, maybe this is a very alternative route, maybe the knight can go this way. There's always some small differences, but right now the A file is also important, as eccentric horse said. So because this bishop is protecting the c6 pawn, then maybe black will be able to put some pieces on the A file and create some pressure there. It's not easy for white to attack this one. But my opponent played b6. What he wanted to do was meet b5 with c5. And in this position, he is very ready to meet b5. Clever chess stuff. As after d takes c5 and knight takes c5, this is what some of the stuff we spoke about in the beginning. This d pawn is isolated, but it's actually not very weak because it's difficult for white to attack it. And here black has ideas of playing d4, and also black's kingside structure is a little bit better than white's because of this double pawn here. So this knight actually has a bright future on g4 to e5. For b6, I played knight f3 and my opponent played c5. And now we get the kind of position after taking this pawn a lot of times. B takes, d takes, d takes and what you have to be careful here is that after knight takes c5 and knight takes d5, unleashing an attack against this knight on c5, if you take on d3, knight takes f6 as a check, and here white won a pawn. So my opponent, he wasn't able to take back the pawn immediately, but he had calculated this. After queen c7, he is attacking the pawn twice, and he will be able to take it on the next move. I played rook fc1, and after queen c5 and knight e2, we had this position. And this position is, despite the isolated pawn on d5, it is completely fine for black, and the game eventually, after 50 moves or more from here, ended in a draw. So I hope you feel like you learned some new stuff today and that you've gotten a deeper understanding of this minority attack, some of the ways to meet the minority attack, when it's good, when it's not necessarily as good. And I hope you in general just enjoyed this lesson. And then I hope that you will all continue having a very good